So the goal of my talk today is to give a critical introduction to the term self-onus ambiguity. And I know that a few of you have actually worked on self-onus ambiguity, so I'm especially keen to hear your thoughts on the, I suppose, more critical bits of this critical introduction. So whether or not you've heard about self-onus ambiguity before, I thought I would just start us off with a few examples so that everyone has a feel for the phenomenon we're talking about today. So Ruth Henry in her personal account says, "I think I was born with the tendency to think pessimistically and be overly sensitive and anxious. At what point did my temperament metamorphose into symptoms of a disease? Are they distinct or are they one and the same?" Next, Christine, who's a participant in a support group for depression and bipolar disorder, says, "I think I'm a little hypomanic today, but maybe I'm just excited because I got a call about a job interview. It's hard to tell." And this participant in Hope et al.'s study with women with anorexia said, "Am I being anorexic because I'm not having a spread, or is that me being perfectly capable of making my own decision about what I do and don't like?" And finally, from a third person perspective, we have psychiatrist Jacinta Tam saying, "Are such refusals the patient's real wishes, or are they the anorexia talking?" So all these examples would fall under what is called self-onus ambiguity, which is often understood as a kind of attempt to distinguish who someone is from their mental health condition. Now, that definition is itself something that I want to scrutinize today, but this is just the working definition for now. So in what follows, I'm hoping to give you a bit of background about the term self-onus ambiguity, about how it's been defined and how research about it has developed. Then I'll present to you a taxonomy of self-onus ambiguity forms before raising some skeptical questions about the extent to which we can separate self and mental illness in the way that self-onus ambiguity sometimes seems to presuppose. And finally, I'll offer some considerations on possible options for answering those skeptical questions. So a bit of background about the term. The term self-onus ambiguity was first coined by psychiatrist and philosopher John Sadler, who described it as a fundamental blurring of mental illness and the personal self. And he noted that this can be reflected in questions commonly arising within treatment, such as, is it me or my disorder, or is this my illness talking? Sociologist David Karp had previously spoken of illness ambiguity, which he observed in self-help groups for affective disorders. And in his later book, Is It Me or My Meds?, he nicely summarized self-onus ambiguity with the slogan, "If I experience X, is it because of the illness, the medication, or is it just me?" And more recently, Roy Dings, whom I'm now happy to be able to call a collaborator of mine, has revived the discussion about self-onus ambiguity in his PhD thesis and also in a special issue on the subject in Philosophical Explorations, to which I also contributed together with Doug McConnell. Roy Dings and his then PhD supervisor Gerrit Glass have described self-onus ambiguity as the difficulty in distinguishing oneself or who one is from a mental disorder or diagnosis. Such ambiguity might be expressed in statements such as, "Is it me or my mental disorder?" And interestingly, Dings and colleagues have actually put self-onus ambiguity in the context of wider self-ambiguity that they suggest we might all experience in everyday life. For instance, when we consider how simple factors like upbringing or even hunger might affect us. And it's also worth noting here that although I'm focusing on the psychiatric context today, self-onus ambiguity can also occur in somatic conditions. So we can also imagine, for instance, someone with diabetes wondering whether an angry outburst was caused by low blood sugar. That too would count as a case of self-illness ambiguity. But we can imagine that things get especially complex in the context of mental illness and as well as psychiatric medications. Okay. Now, in part, thanks to the special issue in philosophical explorations that I mentioned, there's recently been a real surge in philosophical attention paid to self-illness ambiguity. So this is all just to visualize what a boom the topic has had. And this body of literature has also included work on self-illness ambiguity in different diagnoses, including anorexia, addiction, personality disorders, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, as well as autism. And I think that's quite important because we can imagine that there will be important differences in how self-illness ambiguity expresses itself, for instance, between continuous and episodic conditions and between short-term and chronic cases. Now, Roy Dinks and I have also contributed to this mass of papers, and we've looked at some of this growing literature and thought that some nuance could be added to do justice to what a heterogeneous phenomenon self-illness ambiguity really is. And so in this paper that I've indicated here, which we published in Synthese called Explicating the Complexity of Self-Illness Ambiguity, we have developed a taxonomy of self-illness ambiguity forms that I'd like to present to you in the following. So most of what I'm going to say is based on this paper. Also, for those of you who might be interested in the more clinical implications of this taxonomy, we've discussed those in a separate paper in the British Journal of Psychiatry that I've also indicated here, but I'll also talk about some of the clinical normative implications today. Now, our taxonomy is represented in the table that you see here, but please don't worry about reading it all quickly now, because I'm going to go through each of these distinctions in the following. I'm going to start by talking about identity-related and agential self-illness ambiguity. Then I'll move to self-illness ambiguity from a first and from a third-person perspective. Then self-illness ambiguity in a reflective and an unreflective mode. And finally, self-illness ambiguity at different levels of generality or abstraction. And I will illustrate these distinctions by using examples from the study by David Karp that I mentioned earlier, in which he studied statements by participants in self-help groups for affective disorders such as depression and bipolar disorder. Now, the first and perhaps most important one of these distinctions is that between identity-related and agential self-illness ambiguity. So identity-related self-illness ambiguity may be represented by the slogan, "How do I relate to my illness? Is it part of who I am?" Whereas agential self-illness ambiguity may be represented by the slogan, "Is it me or is it my illness that makes me behave, think, feel a certain way?" And Roy and I thought that this distinction has been missing in the literature. So for instance, when Gerrit Glas describes self-illness ambiguity as follows, he says, "The term self-illness ambiguity was coined by John Sadler to refer to the difficulty patients with mental disorder may have to distinguish themselves or who they are from their illness. Especially in chronic cases, it may be unclear or ambiguous for the patient, but also for relatives and other important others, whether a given experience, inclination, or behavior belongs to patients themselves or to the disorder." So we think that this first part describes identity-related self-illness ambiguity, but the second one actually refers to agential self-illness ambiguity. And this distinction will become clearer if we turn to some examples from Karp's study. So this first person in the study expresses identity-related self-illness ambiguity when they say, "I'm trying to discover my basic personality aside from the disease. That's why I'm at these meetings, to discover which is which." So they are trying to determine a line between who they are and their illness. And here you see that identity-related self-illness ambiguity concerns two elements, the person and the illness. The person wonders how the whole illness, as it were, relates to their whole identity, including whether the illness is part of who they are. By contrast, this next person expresses agential self-onus ambiguity when she asks, do I not want to go back to work as a preschool teacher, or is it because of the illness that I don't want to return? So here we have a person wondering whether it's her illness that makes her want or not want to do something, in this case, return to work as a preschool teacher. She's attempting to make sense of a motive for action, or I suppose in this case, a lack thereof, struggling to determine how it relates to her real wishes, and to her illness. So agential self-onus ambiguity concerns a relation between three elements: the person, their illness, and an action. I should stress that action is to be understood really broadly here. So agential self-onus ambiguity can pertain not just to overt actions, but also to feelings, desires, attitudes, decisions, etc. And it's also important to stress that we, of course, don't mean to say that identity and agency are wholly divorced from each other. In many cases, actions will to some extent flow from one's identity and might in turn inform what one's identity is. Still, we think it's important to distinguish identity-related and agential self-onus ambiguity, at least conceptually, if only because if we look at some statements of agential self-onus ambiguity, such as, is it me or my illness that makes me do this, this might presuppose that the person in question has already determined that the illness is not part of them at the identity level. Now, I'll come back later to some of the ways in which this might be an unhelpful assumption, but we can note at this point that in any case, it might be helpful in a therapeutic context for this assumption to be actively addressed and perhaps challenged. So we could imagine, for instance, our doubtful teacher here reflecting on her relation to her illness, if she's prompted by a clinician to think about the fact that how she has formulated her agential self-onus ambiguity might indicate that she has conceptualized her illness as separate from herself. There's also another example of agential self-onus ambiguity, or I suppose of resolved agential self-onus ambiguity in CARB study. So we have another participant saying, I would always start courses and then drop out. I used to think I was easily bored. Now I don't blame myself or the class. It's not me or the class, it's the illness. I shall discuss this example of agential self-onus ambiguity later in the talk, because it's especially pertinent to questions of responsibility that I want to address later. So with this distinction between identity-related and agential self-onus ambiguity in place, we can also return to the examples I started my presentation with and see that those actually contain examples of both identity-related and of agential self-onus ambiguity. So this first person wondering about the relationship between their character and their illness is expressing identity-related self-onus ambiguity, whereas these other people who are wondering about particular emotions, decisions, and wishes, be it in themselves or in others, are uttering agential self-onus ambiguity. And speaking of ambiguity in others, this last example is not just an example of agential self-onus ambiguity, but also an example of ambiguity from a third-person perspective. So Dings and De Bruin already pointed out that self-onus ambiguity can occur not just from the first-person perspective of the person with the mental health condition, but it can also occur from the perspective of third parties like friends or family. And we can also imagine that self-onus ambiguity from a third-person perspective will have especially far-reaching ethical implications when it's uttered by clinicians, as it is in this case by psychiatrist Jacinta Tan, who by refusals is referring specifically to treatment refusals, of which she's unsure whether those are the anorexia talking. So here, self-onus ambiguity connects to important debates about decision-making capacity in clinical contexts. And here too, we think that focusing on agential self-onus ambiguity, especially from a third-person perspective, can be quite helpful for illuminating those contexts. Now, in CARB study, we can also see an example of agential self-onus ambiguity from a third-person perspective, namely in this woman who says that sometimes she wonders whether she's really listening to her husband talk or whether it's his bipolar disorder talking. And we can also add here that kind of by the nature of these statements all being quotes from a self-help group in which people actively discuss their situations, these are all cases of what one might call reflective self-onus ambiguity. So that's self-onus ambiguity where people really actively sit down to explicitly reflect about their relationship to their illness and perhaps their actions. But it's worth noting here that especially before this, there might often also be unreflective self-onus ambiguity. So that's more of an immediately felt or embodied experience of ambiguity, or something just feeling not quite right, not quite owned, not quite disowned. And that can then often trigger that conscious reflection in the first place. So for instance, we could also imagine that this doubtful teacher, that she also really feels that ambiguity when she's trying to approach the classroom. And Dings and Glass have actually argued that self-onus ambiguity might often arise when there's a mismatch between one's reflective self-understanding and one's unreflective self-understanding. One's unreflective self-experience. And Roy and I have devised a hypothetical example of this, because it's of course difficult to get explicit examples of unreflective self-onus ambiguity. So we have described this hypothetical example in our British Journal of Psychiatry article. So let me just read this to you. Imagine the hypothetical example of Peter, who has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Suppose his therapist informed Peter that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder and emphasized the importance of person-first language. On this basis, Peter constructs the self-narrative of someone who has autism. However, this conceptualization does not feel right to Peter in his day-to-day life. The pervasiveness and omnipresence of some of his symptoms make him feel like he is autistic rather than has autism. Furthermore, while he dislikes some of his putative symptoms, like his sensory overload, others, like his strong and highly focused interests, feel as truly his rather than the result of an atypical neurodevelopmental trajectory. Now, I should, of course, note that the term self-illness ambiguity might have to be used with some caution here, because autism is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder and not a mental illness. But it's nevertheless a diagnosis that can be within the remit of psychiatric care, and that also particularly often raises questions about how diagnoses relate to people's identities. So in Peter's case, we see the described mismatch between unreflective self-experience and reflective self-understanding. And we could, for instance, in practice, imagine a clinician working with Peter to bring those two more in line with each other. For instance, either by helping him revise his self-narrative in a way that they find a conceptualization of autism that fits how he feels in his self-experience, or conversely, propose body-focused therapies to further explore Peter's bodily and affective feelings about his diagnosis. And this case also underlines that there can be important disagreements between first-person and third-person perspectives in self-onus ambiguity. For instance, on what to even count as a symptom in the first place. So John Sadler already noted that in this way, self-onus ambiguity actually puts pressure on the idea that person-first language is necessarily preferable to identity-first language. And we, of course, see that debate happening a lot in the context of autism. And part of the question here is also how to even think about what the condition in question is. And that leads me to one final distinction in our taxonomy, which pertains to levels of abstraction in self-onus ambiguity. So the examples I discussed so far are mostly particular or concrete cases, in the sense that they describe cases of specific individuals wondering about their particular situation. But self-onus ambiguity can also involve more abstract, reflective questions about the very concepts self, mental illness, agency, etc., and about their theoretical relation. So we see that, for instance, in this quote from the beginning, in which the person seems to struggle also with the more abstract question of what mental illness even is and how it relates to concepts such as personality and the self. So she asks, are they distinct or are they one and the same? So what might add to people's ambiguity, at least in some views, is that there is, of course, no uncontested concept of what the self is, of what mental illness is. There isn't even an uncontested answer to the demarcation question in psychiatry, so to what even distinguishes mental illness from mental health in the first place. And so if we think that people's experience of self-illness ambiguity is connected to these conceptual questions, then the conceptual unclarity might exacerbate the ambiguous experience. And those abstract questions are, of course, also what philosophers are especially interested in. And this leads me to the second part of my presentation, in which I want to discuss some skeptical questions about theoretical underpinnings of self-illness ambiguity. So when Aurora and I developed the taxonomy that I just presented to you, we explicitly wanted to remain agnostic about the underlying theoretical commitments. So our goal was just to, as it were, map out the surface phenomenon to then enable further research about it. But if we do look at potential underlying commitments of self-illness ambiguity questions such as, is it me or my illness that makes me do this? Then it might be that this seems to presuppose a certain separation between self and mental illness that one might question at the theoretical level. So one of the criticisms has been that self-illness ambiguity may seem to, at least contingently, portray mental illness in an oversimplified, reified, that is, thing-like manner. So there's a worry that people might be thinking of mental illness as a thing to relate to at the identity level and a thing that makes them do certain things at the agency level. So for instance, Sanneke de Haan has pointed out that the very term self-illness ambiguity may invite viewing both mental illness and self as entities and as entities that can be separated. Similarly, Francesca Ervas has said that statements like "it was the illness talking" as potential resolutions of self-illness ambiguity might portray mental illness as a reified entity rather than a collection of symptoms, as separable from the self, and as something with agency in charge of actions or utterances. So Ervas here refers to viewing, for instance, depression as a collection of symptoms rather than as a thing that causes those symptoms. And if we reject the kind of reified causal view and look to the collection of symptoms view, then it becomes much more difficult to separate illness from self, or to say that the illness makes the person exhibit certain symptomatic behaviors or feelings. And similarly, if we look to the self side of the self-illness distinction, there too are problems with the separation. So a separation between self and illness sometimes seems to assume that the relevant self in question is that which can be discovered once mental illness is, as it were, stripped away. So a distinct notion of authentic selfhood as something that is and must be delineated and distanced from the disease. But it's not always clear who is left at that point. And anyway, there are other views, other plausible views of the self and the authentic self. I should say, in the self-illness ambiguity literature, it's not always 100% clear which notion of the self is the relevant one. But in both cases, there are views on which one could very much incorporate aspects of mental illness into the self. Sophia Jepson, in a very insightful article called "Solving the Self-Illness Ambiguity, the Case for Construction over Discovery," that I would recommend to anyone interested in this self-illness distinction question around self-illness ambiguity. She has surveyed several potential views of the self and concluded, I doubt that it's possible to come up with a plausible conception of the self, which is guaranteed to exclude every mental illness symptom, at least not unless an ad hoc condition, according to which mental illness and their symptoms simply cannot be part of the self, is tacked on. So it seems that separating self and illness is also tricky from the point of view of theories of the self. What I'm saying here is not meant to be an exhaustive argument on this point, but just to give you an indication of the kinds of skeptical questions one might have about the self-illness distinction that seems to underlie self-illness ambiguity on at least some views. Indeed, one might also think of selves and mental illnesses as both kind of intertwined clusters of aspects, in which case, as Serifitaken notes, mental disorders express themselves in these multiple dimensions of the self, edifying and constructing in entangled ways the very self that is the subject of mental disorder. Seeking a clear and neat demarcation between self-experience and illness experience, therefore, is not only a futile effort, but may also be disappointing, as it may not be as helpful for the patient as some clinicians and philosophers claim to be. So indeed, that's another angle from which to question the self-illness distinction, that it might be unhelpful for people's self-understanding. So we saw this, for instance, in the case of Peter earlier, who endorsed some of his symptoms but rejected others, leading to an overall ambiguous relationship to his illness. So he couldn't make sense of his experience in this way because it necessarily escaped the binary separation into self versus illness. And this also connects self-illness ambiguity to other well-known issues with psychiatric diagnosis, including Serifitaken's work on hyponarrativity, and also some of the great work that I know many of you are doing on epistemic and especially hermeneutic injustice. So I'd be really keen to discuss those connections further during the Q&A. Okay, so the skeptical questions that I have now raised about separating self and illness put pressure on this picture of epistemic, this picture of self-illness ambiguity as an essentially epistemic problem. So a problem of determining an independent fact of the matter as to where the line between self and illness runs, as well as which actions and mental states stem from which side of the divide. But then the question becomes, how do we reconcile people's expressions of self-illness ambiguity that look as if they presuppose that kind of distinction with these theoretical worries about the feasibility of the distinction? Or put another way, what becomes of self-illness ambiguity discourse if we question that there really is such a self-illness distinction underlying it, kind of under the surface? So I want to discuss a few options for views that one might take on this issue. So one option that Roy and I have considered in the paper that I've been referring to is to essentially just divorce the project of describing how lay people express self-illness ambiguity from the analytic project of scrutinizing philosophical assumptions. So one might take the view that how service users talk about distinguishing themselves from their illness has actually quite little to do with whether any particular metaphysical theory of the self or of mental illness is correct. We have summarized combinations of potential approaches in the table that you see here. So one might not only separate how people talk about self-illness ambiguity from how philosophers analyze concepts such as selfhood, mental disorder, and agency, but one might also separate that from what clinicians would suggest to a given client as a helpful way of thinking about their relationship to their illness and their actions. So all these might be slightly different projects with different goals. Another suggestion has been offered again by Sophia Jepson, who has suggested giving up on there being such a real boundary between self and illness, and to instead embrace a constructivist approach on which we ask people to themselves draw a boundary between who they are and their illness, perhaps based on who they want to be or where it would be helpful to draw that boundary for treatment purposes. I think that this is a really attractive suggestion because it takes seriously some of the theoretical concerns I've been presenting to you. But I'm still not sure whether this approach fully aligns with the phenomenology of self-onus ambiguity, which, at least in many reports, seems to be one of people really being concerned with finding some fact of the matter. And next, Francesca Ervas has suggested thinking of self-onus ambiguity in metaphorical terms. So she suggests thinking of statements like "it was the illness talking" that we might think are kind of an answer to some self-onus ambiguity questions in metaphorical terms. So taking them not to be literally true, but rather being attempts to understand illness through the metaphor of personhood. And I've recently been trying to make sense of self-onus ambiguity in terms of what I think people might be doing when they utter self-onus ambiguity questions. Namely, I think they might be trying to settle questions of responsibility. So here I want to come back to the earlier example of resolved agential self-onus ambiguity in Karp's study. So to reiterate, the participant said, I would always start courses and then drop out. I used to think I was easily bored. Now I don't blame myself or the class. It's not me or the class, it's the illness. So here we clearly see a concern with questions about responsibility and blame, which, by the way, can, of course, also very much occur from a third person perspective. So we can also imagine this person's professors asking themselves some very similar questions. Indeed, Karp himself noted that the self-help group participants' utterances might be quite intimately connected to questions of responsibility. So he said the ambiguity that people tried to resolve through discussion was whether they were responsible for their feelings, behaviors, and ultimately the direction of their lives, or whether they were simply being pushed around by forces over which they had little control. Now, I don't mean to embrace any particular view of responsibility for now, but even without doing so, we can see that queries about the extent of control one has over one's action, the degree to which these express who one really is, and whether one should be held responsible and or be blamed for them, seem very much at the heart of many self-onus ambiguity questions, and especially of what Roy and I call gentle self-onus ambiguity. And so I've been wondering about the extent to which we might understand self-onus ambiguity questions as questions that in the end aren't really about a self-onus boundary, but rather are about questions of responsibility. Now, of course, we can then still discuss whether self-onus ambiguity is a good way of getting at those questions, seeing as this "my illness made me do it" picture is likely as much an inaccurate representation of responsibility as it is of mental illness. So here's another great quote by Sophia Jepson, where Jepson kind of puts herself in the shoes of the college dropout and says, I recall making decisions based on reasons that seemed to make sense to me at the time, both when I signed up and later when I thought it's just too much and dropped out again. I recall acting on those decisions, not being jerked around like a puppet on strings. So we might still need to be wary of self-onus ambiguity and the implied self-onus distinction perpetuating an image of people's agency that's in the end unhelpful. But I think there's still something to making sense of self-onus ambiguity in terms of these deeper normative concerns that people might have when they utter it, even if the right answer to those concerns won't be kind of its view as the illness, but will rather have to do with more detailed facts about a person's agential capacities. But the details of that account are still very much work in progress that I'm developing at the moment. So that's something that I'd be very keen to discuss further with you during the Q&A, and also to answer any questions that you might have about how exactly I'm imagining this at the moment. So yeah, thank you very much. Here's a very long and to be continued list of all my references and also my image sources. And I'll leave you with that, and yeah, look forward to the Q&A.